Good evening, everybody. We're going to get started. Thank you all for coming to our At the Parsons Table series. I'm Joel Towers. I'm the Dean of Parsons. It is a great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's conversation. I will do a brief introduction both of Paul Goldberger, who, as many of you know, originated this series when he became, at the time, the 11th Dean of Parsons in 2004. In the very long and storied history of this fantastic school that was founded in 1896. And Paul started this series in order to be able to bring the leading lights of art, design, and culture into conversation around a Parsons table, which in fact was designed at Parsons, though not in our New York campus, but in our Paris campus, the beginning of the 20th century. Students working with Jean-Michel Franck came up with the original design, and of course it is one of the iconic pieces of furniture from the 20th century and continues to this day. And Paul started this series in order to have conversation around that table. Paul is now the Joseph Urban Chair, appropriate to this space, a building and an auditorium designed by Joseph Urban, in design and architecture here at Parsons and the New School. The speakers who have joined this series over the years are many and extraordinary, including Ralph Lauren, Sheila Johnson, most recently Thomas Heatherwick, Chuck Close, and many more before that. Paul, I will mention to you only one recent highlight from his very, very long resume, and that is that the recent book that he completed on Frank Gehry, called Building Art, Life and Work of Frank Gehry, this year received an American Academy of Arts and Letters Award in Architecture, and it's just one of so many of the wonderful accolades that Paul carries. And so we're very happy that he continues to do this series. And tonight we are extremely pleased to have David Rockwell, whose name is going to be on the shed, apparently. David, as I'm sure you all know as well, is the founder and president of Rockwell Group, an interdisciplinary architecture and design firm based here in New York and with a satellite office in Madrid that emphasizes innovation and thought leadership in every one of their projects. The firm merges architecture, theater, craftsmanship, and technology to create unique narratives in each project, and Paul will be exploring those narratives in conversation with David. So if you would please help me welcome David Rockwell and Paul Goldberger.
Thank you very much, Joel. David, welcome.
Thank you.
It's great to have you here. The breadth of your firm sort of reminds me a little bit of that great remark that John F. Kennedy made when he was president and gave a dinner for various American Nobel Prize winners at the White House and said, probably there's never been as wide and diverse a range of talent in this room except on the nights when Thomas Jefferson ate dinner alone. Now, I don't mean to compare you to Thomas Jefferson. I'm not going to flatter you that much. And I know that designing buildings, stage sets, theaters, cruise ships, hotels, restaurants, and music venues does not alone make you Thomas Jefferson. But you clearly do see architecture and design as invention, as he did. And you see it also clearly as interconnected with everything else about life, and not as pure form, but as a kind of backdrop for life. Can you sort of talk to that a little bit, and about how you established as diverse a practice as you have?
Sure, I can give it a try.
All right, good.
I've got to say I'm a huge Joseph Urban fan, so being in this room is kind of thrilling as an architect who did many things, and notable mostly, or I think more significantly for his theater work. What we've discovered in our studio, and it seems like it would be a clear point, but the truth is it's something that evolved over the last 10 or 15 years, that so much of our work lives right at the intersection of theater and architecture. And while that seems like it might have been a strategic path, I think you know it was not. It was something we found through trial and error and sort of following our passion. And you know, the link in all of the work is that there's the possibility of sort of deeper connection through live experience. And that was my early interest in theater as a kid, that transformed into much more interest in architecture and public space.
Right.
But I never would have imagined that that would morph into doing projects that really sit at that intersection. So that's a sort of amazing.
When you started out interested in the theater, right?
I started out as a kid interested in theater. Really, what I started out interested in is making. So, like many kids, building things was sort of my passion. But what I found about building was it was a way to deal with transitions in my life, some of them not transitions that I had a choice about, losing parent at a young age, lots of 4 older brothers, and I found my role was making things that, you know, sort of low-tech playhouses, spook houses. And
so, do you mean you kind of retreated into fantasy?
no,
Or is that, no?
No,
Okay.
what I mean is I found that the act of making, and so the theater part of that was my mom, who had been a dancer,
Right.
But as the youngest of 5 boys, that career was over. She was a full-time mom. Started a community theater group on the Jersey Shore in Deal, New Jersey, called the Community Players, right out of Waiting for Guffman, for those of you who know that movie. But I found this very private suburb with big, beautiful houses became an acting out, connected community where everyone wanted to participate. And I recently went back with my daughter to look at this space in Deal, New Jersey that I had these glorious memories of. And of course, none of it had to do with hardware.
Right.
And so I think the interest of how architecture or spaces can be a memory machine.
Yes.
How it produces things that resonate. So that interest in making and sort of participating in a community build then accelerated when we moved to Mexico and I was 12, which was really a lot like Mexico Inside Out.
From Deal, New Jersey to Mexico.
Right.
Right.
No, you know, everything happened in the public. It was all marketplaces and spectacles and so that
a lot of color and intensity, right?
color and intensity and light. It's where I fell in love with what's one of the elements I'm most interested in our work is the use of light. Is almost a tangible thing you can feel. And that the experience that connects various buildings, when you think about some of the great public spaces in Mexico, you think about the experience of those connected buildings, not necessarily just the physicality of the building.
How did you, this is not an architectural question, but how did it happen that you moved to Mexico? I don't think I've ever known that.
In a big station wagon.
Okay. Why were you in the big station wagon going to Mexico?
My dad built a business. And, you know, at 12, you don't get a lot of details, but he sold the business. Ironically, the same year was the first year I came to New York City with my brothers and saw my first Broadway show, walked around the city, went to my first New York City restaurant. And so when he sold his business, what I found out after the fact was he liked the idea of the climate in Mexico. And in Guadalajara, there were a lot of Americans that were there for particular business reasons. But it was, I think, at the end of the day, a godsend for me. Because I think it introduced me to the idea of newness, which is very significant in our work, creating new projects that ask the question of why does it need to be the way it is, and a new culture. So it was a very formative thing.
And the idea of public space, as you've said, too, which Deal, New Jersey is probably not rich in.
No.
Right.
Although it has a lot of Bob Stern houses now.
It didn't then.
It did not then.
No. So we're not going to list them among your primary influences, I don't think. No.
There was no piece of architecture in Deal, New Jersey that was an influence on my work.
Okay, right, okay. You became an architect in spite of Deal, New Jersey, not because of it.
Although Asbury Park, interestingly, is
adjacent pretty much,
and now,
right? Very
you
close.
know, I've lived long enough that it's sort of started to come back, but
Right.
it was in its decline. It was in its early Bruce Springsteen years.
But yes, you are not the Bruce Springsteen of architecture, though. We're not going to try to
No.
present you as
Neither
that.
Thomas Jefferson nor Bruce Springsteen.
Okay, fine. I knew we'd figure out some way to get Thomas Jefferson and Bruce Springsteen into the same sentence. That is probably has never happened before. Then let me ask you, because entertainment is so critical to your work, and I think we'll come in and out of that subject a number of times in the next few minutes. Do you see architecture as fundamentally entertainment? Or is that the wrong question to ask? Is entertainment fundamentally a serious pursuit? Or is architecture fundamentally an entertaining pursuit? Let me put it that way.
I think the entertainment is, I think, first of all, generally pejorative.
Right.
As is the word theatrical.
Mm-hmm.
And what I think about, what interests me in our work theatrically,
Mm-hmm.
is if you think about how every design element in a space communicates,
Mm-hmm.
and you look at the analogy in theater where you're spending 2.5 hours studying every detail, so every nuance, every gesture has some backstory. So I have always been interested in creating places where there's a sense of pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
And I think architects undervalue the significance of places that create a sense of pleasure. Entertainment assumes that something's happening to you that's distracting and entertaining.
Right.
So what I find so extraordinary about the theater is it is entertaining, but also you take 1,200 people,
Mm-hmm.
they come into a space, and they become a kind of live experience community around storytelling. And I think that's really been more the driver. So when we're doing a project like the JetBlue Terminal,
Mm-hmm.
We brought in a choreographer not to be entertaining, but because JetBlue articulated a problem saying 20 million people are going to move through this terminal, and that's a circulation problem.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, it's a problem, but it's also one of the great opportunities to think about the rhythm of an airport and how you move in and out of the city. And so that was a way into that problem.
But tell me, actually, let's stay on that for a moment. I've been to the JetBlue Terminal. It's nice, very nice, actually, and there's a lot visually to do. What do you feel you did there that is distinct from Terminal X, Y, or Z?
A few things.
Okay, how does it make its mark from your standpoint?
Well, we started out by listening.
Okay.
And I think, one of the things architects and set designers have in common is you're evolving a story.
Right.
So in the case of a new piece of theater, you read the script, you talk to the director. In the case of JetBlue, we spent a lot of time speaking to JetBlue, and I was taken with how they described their JetBlue-ness, which is one of the things we wanted to hear about. So the first time I noticed on JetBlue, it was the first airline where you got a coffee cup with the top on it, with the straw through the hole, because they were trying to reduce prices by creating less overlap between flights. They wanted to be able to clean it quicker. There was a sense of no design element should be there without having some reason. So once we thought about JetBlue-ness, we also I felt like an entry to the city should have something to do with the city you're entering. Penn Station is not very celebratory. Grand Central is. We were right next to the glorious Saarinen terminal.
Right.
So we proposed there were certain ideas about New Yorkness that we would introduce along with that. And one of them was the two bleachers that in some ways are analogous to stoops on townhouses, or the desire to perch. And the desire to be a part of movement but be separate from it in a certain way. And then the last problem...
You can kind of hang out and watch people, basically, yeah.
And the last problem was I couldn't figure out why every flight I took, no matter what terminal I went to, I was at the farthest gate.
Right.
You know, that somehow...
Funny thing, I must have been on all your flights. It happens to me, too.
And signage is so counterintuitive. You're looking at the sign and going, so the terminal, that center space, moves you when you're departing to the outside, so you're able to look at all the gates, you know where your gate's going to be, and then you might decide to sort of be in that marketplace either around the perimeter.
Right.
To accomplish that, we brought in a choreographer named Jerry Mitchell, who interestingly said, you know, and it's a little bit high concept. I truthfully didn't feel like it was going to generate a big design solution. But he said, what would it be like to feel like you were leaving the city or arriving the city? And that's why when you arrive in the city, you're moving in between those bleachers and accelerate into the speed of the city.
Do you feel that actually happens? Does it work?
I do.
Yeah. I mean, there is something also I find somewhat kind of lighthearted about that terminal, in a way that JetBlue has an identity that is somewhat lighthearted and less sort of like, you know, the elementary school teacher telling you to behave that American Airlines or Delta Airlines are, you know, where they're just trying to keep you in line. It does seem to be a little open to freedom of movement.
And there is that
within reason.
And then there's that one ring in the center of the space that we connected with cables that is our nod to sort of Saarinen love of you know, levitation flight. And that ring, we in about 2008 started to discover that we wanted to use technology in our spaces that made people more engaged, not separated. Initially at the Biennale in Venice for this large installation. And once we developed that as a tool, we could bring that into projects. So in JetBlue, that ring is able to deliver real-time information that JetBlue can give as you're moving through.
Interesting. That's really, in a way, talking about electronic delivery of information instead of space, in effect, as a gesture. I mean, most great terminals, certainly great railway terminals, but also something like Saarinen's TWA or his Dulles, depend on a kind of monumental space for effect. Do you think one can actually create a viable entrance today without monumentally scaled space?
Well, I think entrance is one of the pieces of architecture that I'm most interested in. And I think there's a direct analogy to theater, where when the curtain comes up, what you expect is whoever is on stage is going to tell you about their world. You're ready to be introduced to a new world. And of course, we had a drink in Chambers once on 56th Street, which is a building we did that's mostly doors, the walnut doors. And so I think you certainly can do that, and part of it is monumental is relative to what else is near it. So I also think it's a good idea. We've had an interesting opportunity at what was the Kodak Theater and now the Dolby Theater.
It's where the Oscars are done.
But we had a chance to work in the theater, which I think every architect who designed a theater should be forced to work in the theater to determine what works and what doesn't work about entry sequence and choreography. And actually, I don't know if you remember, but we ripped up 600 seats in the orchestra to create a different arrangement so that the Oscars would be more intimate.
I mean, after it was built. That was...
Do you want to see an image of it?
Sure, if you have one, let's look at it.
I happen to have one.
You happen to have one, good, all right. Let's let the miracle of technology
Speaking of technology,
do its stuff here.
I may have one.
That's a different one. I mean, the Kodak, now Dolby Theatre, it's a fairly traditional layout, right? With rings of balconies, very much like
Well, what's interesting is, so
an old opera house or something.
it was built to specifically house the Oscars,
Right.
and they wanted, I think, 5,500 seats. They wanted the technology to be invisible, so that when you're watching the broadcast, you don't have a lot of technology. But when we were brought on board to do this, I said to the director, who said, "Would you like to do the Oscars?" I said, "It's really a blood sport, right? People watch the Oscars and say how awful it is."
Right.
And he said, "That's kind of true." And I said, "Well, what do we do about that?" And he said, "Well, let's talk about how to make it not awful." And I went back to looking at, I believe, 1935 when it first started, and it was a celebration of the community of filmmakers.
Yes.
So we ripped out 600 seats, re-platformed it, and terraced it into, this is longer than I thought it was.
It's all right.
So over the course of that time, we recontoured the theater so that all 600 nominees were in the ground space and were in the geometry of the space. So we don't need to watch the full thing. And actually, the day before the Oscars, Saturday, after having convinced the Academy to do this and put in this crystal curtain.
What year was that, by the way?
2009. I was in the theater. It was a rehearsal. I hadn't slept for 2 days, and there was a crashing sound of crystal like a thunderclap. And I
Must
heard
have been Harvey Weinstein coming in or something like that. Sort of.
Thomas Jefferson, Harvey Weinstein.
Right. All right, go on. Anyway.
And I heard over the sound system, "Would David Rockwell please come to the stage?" And I walked up on stage. There was crystal everywhere, as if I had any idea. And at that point, I thought maybe theater's not such a good idea. But if you look, you can see that all the nominees are in the geometry of the setup. So
it's kind of like a golden circle inside, basically.
in fact, the first 11 seconds of the show, we ended up putting a camera on the top so that you would actually see the geometry of it, sort of like Michelangelo's Campidoglio, where
And now,
everyone is part of
here's
it.
your host for the 81st Annual Academy Awards, Hugh Jackman.
He helped. That was good.
Well, let's stay with theaters, since we've moved into that, and it's such a key part of your work. One of my favorite projects is very, very different from the Oscars, the theater you did for TED in Vancouver, which is a dismantleable theater made entirely of timber for use at the TED conference in Vancouver. Can you tell us a little bit about exactly how that came to be and show us an image of it?
I can. It was kind of a dream project for me. And maybe I'll show this animation running, or this setup running behind us. So I had been going to the TED conference.
Right.
How do we mute that?
Good.
Had you been going since Monterey?
I've been, not every year, but sometimes.
So the TED conference started in Monterey in a 600-seat theater, where part of the thrill was it wasn't talks you would all look at 18 minutes online. There was a live experience.
Yes, it was much more like what we're doing now.
Much more
actually.
like, and a lot of the value is what happened in between talks, breakout spaces. Then they moved to Long Beach.
Long Beach, right.
And Long Beach was, I think, 1,800 seats, bigger production value. But, and we had been going on and off through the whole process, and I got a phone call from Chris Anderson, who I had given a talk at the TED conference before I ever designed for theater. And Richard Werman said, talk about something you're a fan of, don't promote your profession. And I talked about theater and put together a talk on the relationship of theater and architecture. And Chris said, how would you like to take a big ballroom in Vancouver and make it work as a sort of seating arrangement, put some bleachers in? And it was really a dream project for me, because I started to think about, you would never create a permanent theater that has 15 different ways to sit in it for a 5-day conference.
Right.
But that's what TED needed. Sometimes you'd want to sit ringside, sometimes you'd want to sit in a group, sometimes you'd want to sit in the back and tweet. You'd want to have all those options. What is that? So we created, we reached out to people who were in the business of building demountable structures, and we found a way to create a 1,300-seat structure made of 8,000 CNC pieces of locally sourced timber that sets up in 5 days and goes away in 2 days. And what we didn't discover till we got deep into the design process is we could remove the exterior skin. So much like a building that has scaffolding, like when Michael Graves did the Washington Monument, the excitement of participation would happen as soon as you approach the building through these two vomitories. So it really was one of those kismet opportunities where what we were invited to do was what I had been thinking about for many years. And I do think architects tend to have longer thoughts like that there's an investigation that you have into something and it doesn't pay off right away. So this, actually 10 years before this, I had designed a scaffolding structure for the Building Museum in DC when they were doing something based on the old Globe. So it had been something I'd been thinking about.
Yeah, it's really quite beautiful too. I mean, it works well. And there's something very enticing about seeing that structure, which also has always seemed to me to be almost metaphorical, like TED, in that it's a thing in the process of becoming,
right,
as opposed to this perfect finished object.
Right.
It feels always as if it's evolving, even though it is actually not.
And you mentioned in the Kodak Theater Opera House, where that's relevant here is there's no view you can have of the speaker that doesn't include audience.
Yes,
so it's very much not a movie one-on-one experience.
Right. You're always right. You're all connected as a community, in effect, which is the idea of TED. You've done an interesting theater project here in New York very recently, I know, and in fact it was new to me till you mentioned it recently, which is a redo of the old Helen Hayes Theater on Broadway. That's an entirely different category, a landmark older New York theater with both the strengths and the weaknesses of those early 20th century theaters. Can you talk a little bit about that and how it differs from the other two?
Well, it's a project I'm super, super excited about. And I think one of the ways a project's a good project when there's just a little bit of fear laced in with the excitement. So working on one of, is it 48 Broadway theaters? I think it's 48 or 49 in the city, which had been sort of mythic for me. I talked about seeing Fiddler on the Roof. And when Second Stage acquired the Helen Hayes Theater, they acquired a landmark, both inside and out. And they brought us on board. And Carol Rothman, who's the artistic director, and they have the Rem Koolhaas Design Theater on 43rd Street, said, we really need something that's contemporary. My first reaction was, contemporary is one of those words that can make you cringe a little bit. It's sort of like the wood-sided houses in Deal that aren't historic, that look like they should be in the Hamptons or something. Because the theater, is a sort of strong object in and of itself. So we started looking at the history of the Helen Hayes, and built in 1912, and it was built as the Little Theater by Winthrop Ames, whose goal was to create in 1912 an alternative to big commercial theater. Sort of astonishing that...
It has a kind of Georgian exterior,
it does.
Actually, right? Yeah.
In 1920 or something, they added a balcony. It was too small. When it opened, we found it had these tapestries by an artist named Boucher that were actually reproductions. So we dove deep into the history of the building, and then I started to think about theaters I'd seen historically, like Joseph Urban's Ziegfeld Theater or the Astor Theater, that used color and saturation around the room. And Broadway theaters, there's some new theaters which are by and large awful. The Minskoff and the Uris, and they're great in terms of stage space, but there's no character. The sense of sequence of arrival's kind of awful. And so we came up with an idea, and it really took a long time to solve this one problem, which is if you could ombre every surface in the theater so that as you got closer to the stage, all your focus went on the stage. So one of the things about architects is when you're seeing a show, the audience does not want to see your architecture.
Right.
They want to see
you
the
want
show.
it to disappear. Right.
So the fact that this color disappears as it gets closer to the stage, and then we proposed to Landmarks that we would take one of the tapestries from Boucher, and we would apply that as a digitized frit that was in a darker blue that would surround all the colors. And I actually have a picture of one. So it opens in February, and this is a photograph of the color being applied. The frit is just beginning. So it was a kind of simple idea that took a long time to find a way to honor this landmark and make it contemporary in a way that didn't get into the way of the architecture.
Well, and you were actually a way to have an impact without literally or materially changing the architecture itself.
Right.
Which you were legally not allowed to do anyway.
Correct.
Right, okay.
We could have proposed it, though.
Right, you could have suggested it and tried to sell the commission on it, but rather than even try, what you were doing, it seems to me, was using light instead of making physical changes.
Exactly right.
Right.
And what could have been projected light we're doing is pigment, which is very much in the history of theater.
So in a way, yes, you're turning the original architecture into the basis for a new interpretation without literally changing it. That's very exciting, actually. That's remarkable. Did that come out of, I know you have a section of your studio you call the Design Lab.
Right.
Rockwell Design Lab. Can you talk about that and how the studio is set up and how that differs from a conventional architectural practice?
Sure. We're organized in studios, which many architecture firms are. We're not project-specific studios, so there's a group of anywhere from 10 to 40 people in a group. And one of the things I've discovered is taking things offline to do R&D. And, I think one of the things architects, I was speaking to a playwright the other day, and we were talking about his work where it's totally generative. A playwright has an idea. Architects in most cases are responding. But we set up the lab to be generative and to develop projects that didn't begin with a client. And it grew into being this kind of technology lab. But for instance, the Imagination Playground, which was a self-initiated, self-funded proposal that we went to the city with, came out of thinking about what I talked about earlier, building boxes and things that were sort of freeing for me as a kid, and post 9/11 in Lower Manhattan, noticing many of the playgrounds were not there anymore, and coming across playgrounds in post-World War II in Europe that were all about making. The last studio, the theater studio that works with me on theater sets, is me and two people, very small. It's not a big team. Theater was the reference point for a lot of our architecture. And what I found now is using the sort of toolbox and kits as an architect and bringing that to theater and vice versa, I think makes the project more interesting.
What I find so remarkable is that you figured out a way to, well, let me start that question differently. For some architects and designers, there's a challenge in balancing their own imagination and creative drive with client service, in effect. And it's often seen as a zero-sum game. the more they put their own imagination into it, the more they risk not serving the needs of their clients well. You, through the design lab and other things, seem to have figured out a way around that dilemma by giving you full reign for your imagination, but also letting a lot of the firm be firmly oriented toward client service. Is that a fair statement, or am I wrong in that?
I think it's a fair statement. I would nuance that a little bit.
Sure.
Be saying that I think what I try and find in projects is where is the open space to create something new. So, the first Nobu 25 years ago, which was a project I pursued, by the way. I was designing an event for Meals on Wheels and was up on a ladder lashing some moon together at the Feast of Many Moons, as if that's why people were coming. I get those moons right, it'll be good. And I tried some of Nobu's rock shrimp. And then I heard he was coming to New York, and we had just designed Vong for Jean-Georges. So,
was that your first restaurant, Vong?
No, my first restaurant, my first project, which I did freelance in the evenings, opened in '84, and it was called Sushi Zen, which is no longer here, but it's moved several times, and that was an amazing experience. But what I was going to say about what I was going to say about Nobu is, I think what we found, I think there's a way to serve the client, and part of it is you have to pick the right clients.
Right. Sure.
But with Nobu, what we found was the synergy was he had spent all this time in South America, and he did not want his cuisine perceived of as traditional Japanese cuisine.
Right.
And that was our way in, not only to address that, but it was really a total shift in food style in that pre-Nobu, there really weren't three-star restaurants with no tablecloths.
Right.
That, the idea that luxury meant eating in an hour and a half and getting 2 hours back to do other things was a kind of shift that Nobu really was a part of. And we found that to be incredibly freeing to say, this restaurant can be much more about ritual and ceremony, and having the sushi bar be open to the kitchen, for instance, because so much of the food is finished, and using images of sort of the countryside, and so I think we try and find that.
And yet, the use of timber did allude, but in a much more subtle way, to certain Japanese traditions.
It did,
but not in a hokey way.
One of the, I don't think so.
I didn't. I'm not saying it did. I said not in a hokey way. Right.
Some may judge it to be.
No, I said not in a hokey way.
I just wish I had a percentage of the hokiness with.
Right. Well, that's true. Yes.
One of the things that's so incredible about restaurants, for me, is I mentioned when I was 12, I came into the city and we ate at Schraff's.
That was your first New York restaurant?
It was my first time dining that wasn't like a competitive sport, because I had older brothers. It was a
right. It was your first time dining in a grown-up place, so to speak. Yes.
But I think restaurants are these amazing sort of mini vacations where you get to have incredible food in these environments that are very specific and very much of their time. And so with Nobu, we've had the rare gift of designing restaurants over 24 years with him, and that's, I think that comes from listening. And one short story is, do any of you know, Boris Aronson, who was one of the greatest set designers of the 20th century, did all the great classic musicals with Hal Prince.
Fiddler on the Roof.
Fiddler on the Roof. And when he designed, he would always put one design element in that he wouldn't tell the director about, which is risky. And for Cabaret, the mirror that sat over the proscenium that reflected back what was going on in Germany, so the audience was complicit, was a gift that the designer gave to Hal. And with Nobu, one of the things we've contributed is, in each Nobu, we bring in one or two craftsmen or artisans. The new Nobu at 195 Broadway has all those sake bottles made by a ceramicist in Montreal. So it's kind of adding a new piece to the dialogue.
That's great. Let's talk about the new Nobu, because what's also notable is that you've done these two very different Nobus in New York for the same client, one almost a generation later when Nobu moved downtown. I mean, it's an extraordinary space because it's in the old AT&T building at 195 Broadway, which is challenging to start with because the architecture is so powerful.
Right.
So how'd you deal with it? I mean, the original Nobu, you had kind of it was like a stage set. You could do whatever you wanted. Here, the original classical building is not going away.
The original Nobu was in a restaurant space that had always failed before. So, and it had a vault in the back. I don't know if you ever saw the back by the kitchen. There was a vault. And so we created an enormous backstory and a sort of wealth of approaches, including, you mentioned wood. Every Nobu has scorched ash tabletops, which is a Japanese tradition that makes you want to touch the table. So there was something about engaging that sense of touch that was seminal, I thought, to Nobu. And when they took this space, Landmarks had already worked with an architect named Michael Gabellini to approve that any insertions in this landmark had to be from 8 feet or below. So it's hard to see in this image, but the bar has lamps on it. All of the furniture has lighting, and everything exists from 8 feet down, including the columns are uplit with bronze caps that are removable. So you could pack it all up. Except for that one piece of, it's actually 8 pieces of blackened scorch ash that weave their way through, and those were made by an artist named John Hushman. And the reason, and we went back to Landmarks and proposed this, and like most hearings, it sort of depends on who speaks first. You know, there's a sort of group dynamic, and I think the commission felt like, first of all, it doesn't damage the fabric of the building, and it does animate it in a way that connects you from the lobby to downstairs, and most of the restaurant is...
It creates actually a wonderful dialogue with those classical columns.
And here you can see a banquette in the back that also has this ash used as a kind of illumination. Then when you get downstairs, the hardest piece was to get that piece to actually be wood weaved downstairs, and then the room down here has no natural light, which was a real challenge. And we went back to another form of origami. This is called kirigami, where it looks like the wood is split open and there's walnut knuckles supported by trees that make a reference to the original Nobu. So that's kind of what that is, including, I mentioned the sake bottles, which is one of my favorite things. We found an artist named Pascal Girardin, and my daughter and I went up there and we made the first mark on one of these. Not one of the prettier marks, but it's up there embedded somewhere.
That's great. No, it's extraordinary too to do something within a stone classical landmark, as 195 Broadway, the old AT&T building is, that also by its nature and tradition has to consist largely of wood. And to make it all work. I mean,
and to make that not feel like a disconnect.
Make it not feel disconnected, make it not feel contrived either, but convincing, which is something.
I also want to say one of the things about restaurants is there's such a link between food service and design. And you know, I fully know that this restaurant that was dreamed up on our own without paying attention to what the chef and what the service was doesn't work. So part of it is, you mentioned understanding service, but it's not just service, it's trying to develop the DNA of a project that's based on real things.
That sounds like a very good segue into another restaurant, while we're on the subject of that, which is Union Square Cafe, where you didn't do the original, but did the redo of it when it moved around the same time as Nobu, in fact, and relocated. And the challenge was to deal with a very different space and yet maintain and extend a certain amount of the feeling of the other one. Can you talk about that a little bit? Certainly very different from Nobu.
Yeah. I had been a friend and a client at Union Square Cafe because I moved into that neighborhood about the same time Danny did.
Back when normal people could afford to be there, right? Before it was whatever, yes.
There's still a few patches of normalcy if you look around, but most restaurants are being kicked out, right? Because they can't afford the rent. But Union Square, when Danny approached us about doing a new Union Square, it was a very daunting project. I mean, it was a high wire act that worked out, but it could have easily not worked out because people loved Union Square, but if you had to say what they loved, it was not about the physicality.
Right.
I mean, the physical layout was compromised, it was episodic. But
yeah,
yet,
it was a little funky. It just kind of worked.
It was found.
Right.
And so you don't want to replicate a found thing. So it was like a meta-portrait. And what we proposed was we would do a sort of experiential X-ray with Danny, looking at table spacing, room sizes, relationship of tables to specific art. And one of the limitations of the original Union Square is the majority of the dining was in a 9'6" ceiling. And I don't know if you remember, over time they tried LED lighting. It was like a test laboratory for how to deal with a low space, but it was a low space. The bar, which everyone loved, was based on the fact that it was in a narrow space, beautiful walnut and cherry bar. So we started to draw out of that what would be the sort of experiential DNA, including, for instance, the windows. We replaced all the windows. If you remember, the original Union Square Cafe had a gridded, divided place with one curtain where you would look down into the room. So it had
from that first dining room to the street, yeah.
So they picked a huge space on 19th and Park Avenue, and our first set of decisions was circulation. And we decided to put the entrance on 19th Street, not on Park, so it was already part of a side street. And I'm looking for a picture of the main space. Early on, I knew that the challenge was to take a tall space and relate it somehow to a series of lower spaces. So those light fixtures, which are made out of perforated bronze and green enamel ceramic, hover at the same height as the original ceiling. And they're very similar to a theatrical scrim. So a scrim in theater, when you see a scrim wall that disappears and you can see through it, it's because you're seeing through to the lightest place. So we created a series of rooms that were layered. And the other thing is, and I think Danny was surprised, we even photographed some things that he didn't love, like the original Union Square had a little rack with umbrellas by the front door. I was interested in that because it was using furniture as a sort of hospitality moment. And that led to the landscape of service stations and coffee stations that, even though the room is open, divide it into spaces that are similar to the proportions of the original Union Square. And then the final thing, which Danny loved doing, is we took every piece of art that had existed, reframed it and rematted it, and made a big model, and with tweezers located it next to tables that had some reference to who sat there.
And also the green wainscoting in that dining room is pretty similar to the old one, right?
A little tweak, but similar, yeah.
Yeah.
Even the chairs are new chairs, and we brought about 20 chairs into the space, and there was the cafe chair, or the bistro chair that he used, which is not very comfortable.
Right.
So this is a kind of new engineered chair that is sleeker and is really comfortable for an hour and a half or 2-hour dinner. And acoustics were a huge issue that, and in fact, we used something we had never done before. The wood ceiling here has micro perforations, so you're able to have a wood panel ceiling, but it absorbs sound.
It's interesting because you've really presented this as a series of micro decisions, we might almost say, small decisions, as opposed to some big, bold, overarching concept. And the subtlety of making it new and old at the same time, or new and familiar at the same time.
I think that's probably accurate. I think this was sort of microsurgery. I think it was intuitive. I think it was less about a sort of definitive partie than it was intuitive and having a sense of, as is hospitality, as is Danny. If you have to say what makes the restaurant extraordinary, it's not going to be 3 or 4 obvious things. So it felt like the design needed to be the same way.
Yeah, which it really is. I mean, it's very, and that wonderful way in which it is simultaneously familiar and new.
Yeah.
I think is sort of walking a tightrope.
It was
very
definitely walking a
tightrope. Yeah, it's really, really wonderful. Another category of your work, and we're not going to cover all of them or we'd be here all night, and we, in a moment, want to open the floor to you here as well. And by the way, we are using our advanced technological system. You are invited to email questions to us, and we'll turn to them in a few minutes. But in the meantime, let me ask you about a whole other category of your work, which is rethinking the workspace. I mean, projects like NeueHouse, for example. Can you talk about that? And because there, you were really helping, you were not simply designing a space, you were helping to
Rethink a business.
Rethink a program and invent a new kind of business almost, right?
Yeah, it was also a case where the client did what really good clients do, which is they define the problem, but they don't define the solution. Because, you know, once, and it's an analogy that I think works in theater very clearly, when a director tells you, I want it to look like this, that's as good as it's going to look.
Right.
That sort of stops the process. So with NeueHouse, this was 3 partners who were in a bunch of startup businesses, and they felt like there were no office spaces that addressed how to be about startup and not be ping pong and beer. You know, that there was a kind of culture that, and so as we started to think about it and talk to them, one of the things that was interesting was having it change over the course of the day, addressing the fact that there is day parting. So that was one guiding principle. Another guiding principle was removing the barriers between the art program, which is significant, the food and beverage program, which is significant, workspace, and the cultural space. That so much of creativity now is in between an individual meeting and a planned meeting. So that sense of serendipity led to many of the decisions, including a space. So these are the library tables. There's many levels you can be a member at. So if you just want to drop in.
So it's a membership club, though, right?
It's a membership
organization of some kind, right?
It's a membership club that I believe operates on several month increments. Although one of the things they found is no one wants to leave. So it does have bigger offices on upper floors, including a system we developed of partitions that allows you to have 2 desks, and you can grow to 8 desks if you want to organically grow. But one of my favorite little details is at 5:30 at night, all these big light fixtures are on manual counter rigs, so they lower, suggesting not only the lights dim, but the scale of the space lowers. And those food carts, which live in the cafe, come out and make it much more about sort of generosity. And then we didn't.
So it's part workspace, part social club, really, in effect, right?
Part workspace, and I would say social club, but what has really differentiated NeueHouse is their cultural programming. They have an incredible lecture series, and so I think members feel like it's about, you know, if you're going to leave your home, since you can do your work in your home, you want to feel like you're in some sort of creative friction with other people. And that creative friction is, I think, what drives NeueHouse, both in New York and in LA, where we're in the old William Paley CBS.
In Hollywood, yeah, the old Les Cars building, right?
And
Gosh, Joseph Urban, William Lescaz, all the great...
Thomas Jefferson.
Thomas, right. Exactly.
So William Lescaz legendarily designed everything down to the microphones for William Paley. And so this is one of the main spaces. And we found these board form concrete openings that were to the studios and decided to expose that. And it has these spaces that are very much sort of layered vertically.
Great.
So yes, I find we do get the opportunity to help refine and invent and develop programs with clients. It happened with the Eleanor Bunin at Lincoln Center.
Right, the Film Society of Lincoln Center space.
So that whole cafe and center lobby came about because we proposed, in addition to seeing film, there would be a space to have a community of people who love film. And because we were underneath the plaza at Lincoln Center, we had to go far enough down to be underneath mechanical systems that we sort of created that center space. So it was not a program thing, it was an invented thing.
Do you feel that clients sometimes come to you wanting you to play with the program a little bit or challenge it?
I think they do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think clients want a lot of things, including a relationship and inspiration and I find a lot of the best ideas are the intersection of other ideas. So
Sure. Great. We have some wonderful questions coming in here. Let me turn to some of them, and please continue to send them. One of them actually goes to something I was about to ask, which is your work at Hudson Yards, where you're doing, along with Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro, which is an interesting partnership, you and them, both the Culture Shed, and you're also working together on a high-rise condo, right?
correct.
Which is not a very typical project either for Rockwell or Diller, Scofidio, Renfro, I would think. Talk about those things. The question specifically is, how did you get involved with Hudson Yards, and how is collaborating with Related, that's the developer, to which I would add, how is collaborating with Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro?
So it's a three-parter.
It's a three-parter. Take it any way you like.
So I'm going to try and keep it brief, but first of all, I'm going to start with the
Hudson Yards?
Hudson Yards Development Corp. Issued a request for ideas and proposals, I think in 2008. And that was the group that had been tasked with thinking about this new immense neighborhood in New York. And on the planning submission and on the rezoning and on the sort of master plan of Hudson Yards, there was a small red dot that was for cultural use. And they were looking for potential ideas. And they had been doing a lot of research about what New York City needed that it didn't have. Remember, 2008 was the beginning of an economic collapse, so there was a kind of an interesting moment in all of that. And Diller, Scofidio, Renfro, and Rockwell Group had collaborated several times before.
At the World Trade Center, I remember originally, right? At the observation?
The first collaboration was in Hong Kong, and it was a project we invited them to partner with us on. It was pre-Renfro, Diller, Scofidio. And you certainly could look at their amazing work and look at our work and say, in terms of vocabulary, they're not that similar. But what I was amazed by is their interest in program and invention. So we had a common interest in program and invention. We sort of had a good relationship, and then we worked together on the viewing platform at Ground Zero.
That I remember.
With Kevin Kennan. And then subsequently that we did another plan for the East River that didn't happen with them. So we proposed, it was really at the Biennale in Venice where we sat down over Bellini and did the first sketch. And it's an extraordinary opportunity to collaborate with them and to collaborate with the city. It is a 501c3, So it sits within Related,
Right.
but it's its own entity. And it is, opportunity to create a new building that embraces visual and live performance that is truly a piece of infrastructure that invites commission artists to invent new ways to work. And I think about for anyone who has toured a theater, I brought a group of students from Yale to the Met. And the architecture students, when they stepped on the stage and looked at the potential of the Fly House, it was so much more interesting than anything else. So this building is really about the potential to create new art forms. It's flexible in a way that is not obtuse. Flexibility in performing arts centers for a while was sort of indecipherable. This is very clear, very much about pure potential. The tower came about as a separate piece of architecture that kept getting closer and closer to the shed. So DSR and Rockwell Group joined forces to not only create that building, but then the shed embedded itself. So the bottom, the shed is an 8-story fixed building with this exposed diagrid steel structure on 8 wheels that can deploy and be an outdoor space or an indoor space. And you can see embedded in the building is a lot of our back of house. So it allows most of the shed to be kind of about pure potential.
And the shed itself is really a vast, undefined space, right? I mean, so it seems to me the thing it will be most like in terms of performance spaces is the Armory on Park Avenue, which is now being used for performance.
Well, Alex Poots is the artistic director, worked at the Armory. He also created the Manchester Festival. And I do think the shed will be a totally new thing in that you're going to be able to have 2 14,000 square foot column-free galleries, a 500-seat black box, an artist lab, lobby that will be full of activity, and a 17,000 square foot, 120-foot tall, temperature-controlled space with an occupiable grid. So if you think about, the Armory is a glorious space, and this will be a great space, but it's been conceived of so that artists can get in and out faster and there can be more sense of simultaneity.
The Armory also makes the city disappear. Here you feel completely engaged with the city in a very different way. Let's go on. The questions are coming in faster than we are able to answer them, so let's get a few more in. Here's a question that goes to your other career as a set designer, which we haven't talked too much about either, except in passing. When designing the set for a film or play, does an actor or actress's physical appearance play an important role in your design? Say the main character has blonde hair. Does it matter to your design? You can go a little beyond that and just talk for a moment about doing stage sets in general, because you've done several Broadway shows.
Well, you certainly tell the actors it's all about them.
Right.
But the reality is most of the work is done before you know who the cast is. On the other hand, She Loves Me, which was just the most amazing gift for me.
Right.
Written by Sheldon Harnick, who at 94, and he had written Fiddler on the Roof, which is the first show I saw. He was very present. So it was a kind of wonderful love song of a show. We did modify the wallpaper in a set that I don't have here, I don't think, to be offset by Jane Krakowski's hair. So that was one case where we actually did modify it in the theater to do that.
But in general, no. Right.
Even though we tell them yes.
Right, okay.
You have to make things. We did a play called Lucky Guy, which was a new Nora Ephron play after she passed away.
Right.
About Mike McAlery that starred, among other people, Tom Hanks.
Right.
And we had a lot of furniture that was actor-driven. you do have to hear a lot from the actors about, do I really have to move this thing? And so, you do custom fit things to actors, but not so much what they look like, more how they move things.
And playwrights often have clear ideas about how they want things to be, right?
And they don't want to hear my notes about their play either.
Well, that must be one reason it's good you enjoy designing Shakespeare.
Shakespeare has no notes.
Shakespeare does not talk back to you about what, right, exactly. And you did this summer, I know you did both shows, both Midsummer Night's Dream and Julius Caesar at the Shakespeare Festival.
I did.
Public theater.
And I had been going to the Delacorte since 1978, and had been sitting there, and it was an amazing summer. I did 3 plays there, and I took a group of architects one night, about 30 people. So part of, we said Midsummer Night's Dream, and at the end, someone said, so do you really need to be here from noon till midnight every night during tech? And I said, no, that's where I want to be. So I do think part of what gives our studio its energy is being willing to embrace a whole range of things. And this was just an inspirational summer, about 100 great interns and just an amazing group of actors.
That's fantastic. You spoke about a restaurant being a mini vacation. Can you also speak about hotel design and how you create a vacation or an experience there?
I can.
Okay, please do.
I think what's interesting about hotels is there's no other, you may be able to think of another example, but design is under such a microscope. If you're spending an evening in a hotel room, you want the light switch to be where you can get it without moving too much. You want the air conditioning not to zoom across the bed. You're under the microscope on a whole set of design decisions that affect comfort, acoustics. So there's micro decisions. And then I do think that hotels are an alternate to our home. And so they're an opportunity to perhaps be a little bit more idiosyncratic and not go for the middle. And we've done hotels at every price point, and I don't think that's a rate issue. I think hotels are I think going for the middle is uninteresting in life.
Right.
And I think it's taking risks. It doesn't always work, but I think hotels invite. And the other thing about hotels, and I said this to a hotel operator, there are many chances to make the wrong first impression. When you think about what doesn't work, and so I think it's about having an approach that is sort of engaging and then proving that through on every decision to not undo people's opinions about it.
What are your favorite hotels, by the way? Just either designed by you or hotels you've had nothing to do with.
Well, the Cipriani in Venice is one of my favorite hotels.
Right.
And I guess, interestingly, that pool supposedly was built at the wrong scale.
Yes, it's huge, right.
But that's an incredible hotel. One of my favorite hotels we designed is the Greenwich Hotel on North Moor for a whole bunch of reasons, but I just think it's a wonderful place to be. I love the Connaught in London.
Which is also a place with a very strong identity, and when you're in it, you feel that you're there and not somewhere else.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of hotels that have
places.
like a stool you can't figure out how to use, like a three-legged stool, or like a TV that's behind the mirror that you can't get to. I don't think it's a place for like IQ tests of how to use the room. We won't name any that do that.
No, but but. You and Philippe Stark are not competing for the same jobs then, right?
We've overlapped some.
Okay.
I see him in airports all the time. And we both worked with Ian, who I know you know well.
Of course. Beyond the faculties of art and design, what is a parallel field that inspires your work?
Well, I think there wouldn't be one. I would think food, clearly.
Right.
And I came to cooking sort of later after I designed a bunch of restaurants, and I had all these cookbooks from chefs. And,
Right.
Actually, I would follow the recipes, like cook 4 or 5 hours a day following a Daniel Boulud recipe. And Barry Wine, who not many people probably know here, but he was the chef of the Quilted Giraffe.
The owner of the Quilted,
Yeah.
right. One of the
So we
first-
lived each other in the country, and he'd come over and he'd say, "What are you making?" And I'd say, "Well, I'm making the Daniel Boulud, blah, blah, blah." And he said, "Well, let's get some stuff out of the fridge and let's make some stuff up." So he sort of got me to improvise. So
Right.
food, photography, travel, nonfiction. I find nonfiction. I'm just finishing Kurt Anderson's book, which is
Oh, yeah. No, which is good.
kind of an amazing look at the world.
Fantasyland. Yeah. Good. As a color scientist, I'm curious to know, at what point on a new concept do you consider color?
Well, in many cases, right at the very beginning. Not always. And in some cases, a project will be something that you study in plan. In some cases, it'll be something you study in section. But color comes into it in many cases. I mean, the Helen Hayes Theater is pure color. Nobu, very much from 24 years ago, was about a color approach that we thought would sort of marry deep blues that relate to Sumi ink and calligraphy and kind of South American spices. So some cases way into the process, in some cases the concept or partie will involve color. I think the trick is to figure out what's the central problem to solve. Is it a planning problem? Is it a section problem? Is it a lighting problem, or is it a color problem?
Right. But it seems to me as though color is always a critical element of your work, whether it is the lead element or not.
Yeah.
It would be fair to say. But you can't actually generalize. Okay. Here's a question that is addressed to both you and me, but does not involve your work, which is, what do we think of the loss of Diller Island? That's the Heatherwick project for Pier 55. Will it be revived? Should it be?
You want me to go first? I loved the design. I thought it was an extraordinarily generous gesture. I thought it was totally unique. And it's something, I mean, I judge a design by, I always wanted to know more about it. I wanted to know how it was being used. So I think it's a shame, and I hope it'll be revived. When you drive by, it's amazing how much work has been done already.
Right.
So I don't know. I'm an optimist. I think it was such a strong idea that maybe it'll be revived.
Yeah, I always thought it was a better idea, certainly, than the Garden Bridge in London, which I did not regret the demise of particularly. I mean, it was probably extraordinarily expensive for what it was going to be, and I had some concern about the ongoing maintenance costs and whether even the extraordinary philanthropic generosity that was going to build it would be sufficient to carry it forward indefinitely and maintain it properly. But none of those were reasons to not have it happen.
When I say I want to know more about it, what was never, I think, understood, I guess was understood by the people doing it, is how exactly it was going to be used. And I think like interesting parks, it would have been used in ways that maybe they hadn't predicted. So I know there were individual performance spaces, but it just felt like a great alternative, very expensive idea.
Right. But the notion, I have to say, I certainly did not agree with the notion that it was just, a billionaire's indulgence.
No.
I mean, it was a public place.
And a real gift to the city.
And a gift to the city, exactly. And so I...
But it just shows, it's such a complex city, and there's a lot of caution. And
Right.
Will it come back, do you think?
Well, it's up to Barry Diller as much as anything else, I think, actually, whether it comes back. I mean, I think he pulled the plug out of frustration. I don't know. I mean, I wondered for a moment if the cancellation of it wasn't calling someone's bluff, but I don't know.
So after the viewing platform with Diller, Scofidio, and Kevin Kennan, one of the funders, we raised the money for the viewing platform, and one of the people who gave us the money said, well, what's your foundation going to do next? And I said, well, that was it. He said, why don't you think of another project? And we proposed on Fulton Street something called the Incubator, and got a lot of arts groups involved and raised some money. And early on, we were advised by a lobbyist, this is never going to happen when you think about all of the complexities in that case. And that's actually what led to the playground, is hitting a roadblock on developing this thing. I said, well, why don't we just redirect the resources and create a playground?
Great. Our time is almost up, but we've got a couple of other really interesting ones that are quick, and let's try to do fast. One of them is, what is a quirk, superstition, or something unique to your personal design process? All right, you have no quirks or superstitions, I see, okay.
I wear pretty much the same outfit every day. Is that a quirk?
Not for architects, it's certainly not, no. As an architect, it would be a quirk if you did not wear black, I would say.
Is it a quirk that we have about 10 dogs in our studio every day?
Only if they are part of your design process.
Oh, they're apps.
I mean, if we're going to go back, if we're going to speak to the question.
Yeah, when we have a client that asks something we don't like, we say, talk to the dog.
Are they part of a studio? Do they comprise their own studio, or is there one dog per studio? How does it work?
They're very distributed.
Very distributed, okay. Good.
I like, a thick, I think most designers find the tool they like most. So there is a specific Pentel pen that
okay.
I need to have.
But you don't have one single lucky one that you carry around with you and try.
No.
Good. All right. I'm relieved actually to hear you say that. What's a project that you've never done that you would most like to do? I mean,
God, that's just, there's many. One building type I've been interested in for a long time is stadiums. And I'm a football fan.
Right.
And it just doesn't quite make sense that, $1.8 billion is used for 14 times a year.
Right.
And so I've been intrigued by whether you could merge the role of a park in the role of a stadium in some way. So that's a sort of pet project.
You can much better with baseball, actually.
And they have historically.
And they have historically. And in fact, most serious aficionados of baseball stadiums call them baseball parks and not baseball. And so, in fact, there's a long history of interconnection there, but there's not with football. That's true.
Another project type I'd be very interested in is a dormitory. I've been looking at colleges with my son,
right,
and went back to see my dormitory, which looked a lot like a prison. And just thinking about
where was that? Which
Syracuse.
Syracuse, right.
And thinking about how much learning goes on outside of the classroom, I think that would be an interest. And there are many architects who have done interesting forms.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Good. Let's end with this. I think it's a wonderful final question before we adjourn. What is the best design advice anyone ever gave you?
The best design advice I can think of was my first year at Syracuse. And we had a sort of strict Bauhaus design professor. And our first assignment was to go draw something on the campus. I was right off the boat from Mexico. Actually, I drove from Guadalajara with my Mexican huaraches on and sat down next to Hendricks Chapel and was drawing a piece of it. And I looked around, and this kid, Jeff Hill, had drawn the entire campus, like M.C. Escher, just this. So that was daunting. And then that night, Buckminster Fuller was speaking at Hendricks Chapel. No one understood every other word he said. It was just, and I thought, wow. And then the next day, we had a basic design project that I had trouble with, and I went to see this professor named Siegfried, and I said, I think I made a mistake. I think the kid's drawing the campus, I'm drawing the sandal. I just think this is, And he said to me, you just may have a little less to unlearn than everyone else.
Ah.
And that was, at least in the moment, you know, the kind of thing where you go, well, I'll give it a try.
I can think of no better line to end with in a design school than you may have a little less to unlearn than everybody else, actually. David, thank you very much. This is great. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all very much for being here. Great.